And so these were activities that Southern enterprises and Northern enterprises had interest in. And significantly, when all of this metastasized, when it became most powerful, most endemic, and came to affect the most number of people, was at the very beginning of the 20th century, at a time when whites in all parts of America had essentially given up on the idea of black citizenship. And so when W.E.B. Du Bois was forming the NAACP in 1913 and then coming to speak here a little less than 10 years after that, black Americans all over the country knew what was happening, were acutely aware of it. Du Bois described these exact things in the Souls of Black Folk in 1903 and many others of his writings. But white Americans, even though there were a certain number of people, and they are the part of our past that we're most comfortable with, some of whom were members of this club, probably, in those early years, and they were the good people who realized, as the founders of this club did, that blacks and whites needed to both be here, needed to both be at the table. And so there were those voices, but for the most part, the overwhelming position of whites in all parts of America, including here, was that the country had been fighting for 35 years about what to do with the freed Negro, and they were tired of the fight. All across America, they were tired of the fight. And when Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901, he represented a new generation of republicanism. He started his presidential tenure with very idealistic, liberal, we would call, ideas about race and about guaranteeing the rights and legal citizenship to African Americans. But by the end of his terms in the presidency, Teddy Roosevelt was terribly wrong on race, had completely lost his way on race. And I know we have a family here whose family dates back to that administration. But by 1901, whites in America, by and large, had given up on the idea of black citizenship, and these terrible practices in the South metastasized and came to circumscribe the lives of millions of African Americans. And those practices continued deep into the 20th century, right up into the World War II era, and vestiges of it, explicit vestiges of it, not echoes, explicit vestiges of these practices, in fact, lived into the 1950s and 60s, some would say the 1970s. And those events are a fundamental explanation for the divide that persists in America between blacks and whites in terms of wealth attainment and educational achievement, where most of us learned or absorbed somehow that the differences between whites and blacks are rooted in old slavery and the poverty and illiteracy of African Americans in 1865. In reality, that's not the case. But what is the case is the fact that slavery persisted into the 1930s, into the lives of people who are here today, and certainly into the lives of the parents and grandparents of African Americans who you know, whether they know that story or not. And I can tell you over the past 2 years, again and again and again, people come up to me after an event like this, young African Americans will come up and say, now I understand the story that my grandmother used to tell before she died about the farm in South Georgia that they couldn't leave, where the man wouldn't let them go and they were never paid, and they only got off that farm when an older brother came back after World War II or during World War II, came back from military service and spirited them away in the middle of the night. Those kinds of things happen to thousands and thousands of people and explain so much about the way that America works today. That's Slavery by Another Name. That's what that book is about. Now, a number of you are already formulating a question that I'm going to answer very quickly now, and that is, why would a white guy from Mississippi who grew up in a little cotton town, who works for Rupert Murdoch at the most conservative newspaper in America, write this book? And there's a longer answer to that, but the quick one is that my little town in Mississippi, where I grew up, I was born in the fall of 1964, a few months after Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, the civil rights workers, were murdered in Mississippi in a place not all that far from where I grew up. And so I was born there in 1964. In 1965, there was a farm labor strike on the outskirts of my town that was one of the first farm labor actions anywhere in the South since the Great Depression. Made a big impression on me somehow, though it's vague. I had some awareness of it as a child, apparently. 1968, there was a riot in my town after a group of black high school students marched from the black high school to the white high school protesting that 15 years after the Brown decision, schools were still archly segregated. And then in 1969, and at the end of that riot, there was an African-American boy was shot by a white store owner. There was never an investigation. The man was never charged with that. And then in 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court ordered that the schools in my town and 29 other districts in Mississippi be immediately integrated. And they were, at the order of the courts. And then I began the first grade the following fall in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade, black and white together, and go through 12 grades of public education. And so I grew up in this world, though I was largely unconscious of those things, but I grew up in this radically upset place where there was a confusing, bizarre in some respects, but I was going to these overwhelmingly black schools as a part of a very small number of white families who stayed in the public school system after those events, and I was profoundly affected by all of that, even though I didn't know those events. But from a very early stage, I began to ask the question again and again, why is this? Why are things the way they are? Why are all the black kids mad at me at all times for reasons I can't put my finger on? So why am I mad back at them? Why is it that the white kids I go to church with who go to the all-white segregationist school that was created overnight so that they didn't have to go to school with black kids, why are those kids who I go to church with, why are they mad at me? And what exactly is it that's wrong with them? Because there's some message here that there's something immoral about them and their families, but no one will say quite what it is. All of these confusing things that I was very, very troubled by as a child. And why was it that the swimming pool we went to, built by the city and operated by the city, only had white people in it, and there wasn't a swimming pool in the black part of town? Why were all of those things? Why was my baseball team all white? All of these aspects in which I had this integrated life in school and an archly segregated life in every other way. And so I asked those questions, which were generally unwelcome questions in those days. But as the years went by, I kept asking them and began to write about some of these things. And in fact, when I was a 7th grader, I wrote an essay for the County Historical Society essay contest celebrating the 150th anniversary of the county or the town or something. And I submitted an essay that was about that farm labor strike that had happened in 1965. And the story of the strikers and what happened to them and how they were attacked by the Ku Klux Klan and survived that and built a little community that came to be known as Strike City. I still today don't really know how I knew about that because no white person would have discussed it in those days, in 1977. But I think I went to school with children who lived there, and that must have been how I had some awareness of it. But so I wrote this little essay, a happy 2-page 7th grader essay, about this event, and it ended upliftingly, how the strikers persevered and America was great at the end of the essay. I submitted it, and it turned out that I won 2nd place. And I was supposed to go to the county fair to pick up my prize on my certificate on a particular day, and I went there. My mother dropped me off, something you'd never do with a 12-year-old at the county fair today. I went to the appointed place where I was to meet Mrs. Baker, a white lady who was going to be wearing a blue dress. And I got there, and there was Ms. Baker in the blue dress. But I was too timid to step up and say who I was. I was afraid I would be wrong, that it wasn't her, and I would be embarrassed. So I stood there for a long time as she scanned the crowd, never looking at me several times, never detecting identity. And then finally another little white boy came along, and they began talking. They knew each other and said something about the contest. He clearly was another winner, and I knew him from church circles, so I walked up and said who I was. And Mrs. Baker looked at me, and I don't know if I realized it at exactly that instant or if it came to me later, but somehow the combination of the topic of my essay, the fact that I came from an overwhelmingly black school, the oddity of my last name, all of those things conspired. I was supposed to have been the little black boy getting a certificate that morning. So, as I said yesterday, I've always considered myself an early beneficiary of affirmative action. But the following year, I converted that essay into a speech.